Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Brath Wang. On the first day of the month, we saw an escalation in the Middle East that could threaten to upend global stability. Iran launched its largest attack on Israel with 180 missiles in retaliation for the recent killings of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. Despite Iranian claims that it hit 90% of its targets, Israel said that with U.S. help, it was able to intercept most of the missiles. Joining us to discuss this today are Guermantes Lailari, retired U.S. Air Force Foreign Area Officer specializing in counterterrorism, irregular warfare, and missile defense. Vincent Chao, Taipei City Councilor from the ruling DPP and former TECRO Taiwan Representative Office in the U.S. Political Division Director, and Cai Rongxiang, National Zhongzhen University Political Science Professor. A very warm welcome to all on the show today. Let's first talk about the role of the United States and the already simmering tensions between Israel and Iran. We then also just saw Israel attack Lebanon. Guermantes, as a military officer based in Israel for over a decade, do you see a full-blown out war?
I don't think the parties want that. The problem is that Iran has struck Israel in April with ballistic missiles and drones and cruise missiles, and again with the ballistic missiles at the beginning of this month. And so Israel can't just leave it alone. Secondly, Iran supports many of the terrorist organizations in the Middle East: Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iraqi insurgents, Syrian insurgents. These are all groups that are proxies for Iran, and these groups have been attacking both Israel and America, but mainly Israel. So Israel has to respond to this. It's not something that you can just ignore. When someone launches a missile at you, you also don't know what the warhead is on it. It could be conventional, it could be unconventional. So Israel doesn't want to take a risk that one of these missiles coming at it could be a nuclear bomb, and that would be a completely different story. And they can't take the risk of letting any of these missiles land in Israel. So it puts it in a very difficult situation, and therefore it has to respond. Now, whether the U.S. complicitly or implicitly participates is another story. Up to now, the U.S. and its allies have supported Israel by providing missile defense and drone defense against these attacks. So therefore, up till now, the U.S. has helped Israel, but not to the point where Israel can't do anything. In other words, if the United States doesn't participate, Israel could still conduct an operation against Iran.
Apart from these defense missiles that you said the U.S. provided, you've spent most of your career in the U.S. military. Do you feel that the U.S. is doing enough, or do you feel that the U.S., in terms of actually mediating, is not doing enough?
Well, it's hard to mediate with a government that promotes terrorism in the Middle East. And the government of Iran is also supported by Russia and China. After all, China provided a $250 billion aid package based on its sales of oil to China, which include missile development, intelligence support to Iran. So therefore, it's hard for the United States to mediate because of the supporters of Iran.
Vincent, let me turn to you. How do you feel this could escalate in terms of, G-Man talked about the U.S. and its support and dealing with an authoritarian regime and a regime that supports terrorism. You see similarities in terms of the authoritarian part with China. Yeah. Do you feel that the support that Taiwan gets from the U.S. is sufficient?
I mean, we were talking about this before the show began, which is how do you actually pronounce Iran, Iran? And I think one of the questions is, of course, is that Iran's so far away and that it's not a popular talking topic here in Taiwan. So I commend Taiwan Talks for dealing with this really tough and politically sensitive issue. But it's true that security in the Middle East impacts Taiwan directly. I mean, the price of gas notwithstanding, I mean, we've seen this single largest, I think, increase in Brent futures over just the past few days because of some off-the-cuff remarks that President Biden made. But I think the key point is this, is that how, are there possibilities where both sides de-escalate the situation? Are there possibilities where we veer off the edge of conflict, at least as we currently see it right now? And I think yes. And I think the critical part of that is that I don't think Iran wants a war. I don't think Israel wants a war. I think both of them, to some degree, want to save face. They want to show that actions have consequences. They want to penalize each other for actions they perceive the other to be doing. But I don't think any party really wants to see a full-blown hot war in the Middle East. I mean, we haven't seen that. I mean, I would argue for Israel, since the 1970s. But certainly there's been limited skirmishes and campaigns since then. But I guess the point is I'm trying to draw is this. So when Iran did its second missile strike against Israel, I mean, look at what it accomplished. It accomplished almost nothing. I mean, they sent close to 200 missiles. They ended up killing, unfortunately, a Palestinian person, one Palestinian person, hit a bunch of parking lots, at least the fragments did. Almost all the missiles and drones got intercepted with the help, like you mentioned, with the United States. But it accomplished very little. But it sent a strong political message that, Iran, we're fighting back. We're not taking this from Israel. I mean, a lot of countries in the region, Lebanon, the Houthis certainly, I mean, everybody was on the streets cheering. There's Iran, fighting back against Israel. But I think Iran calibrated it in a way where it was de-escalatory in nature. And I think, and I hope that Israel does the same as well. Now, I think Israel will be under pressure to show, again, that actions have consequences. They could do a counterstrike. They did last time in the first, but it was clear Israel wanted to show it had the capabilities to bomb Iran's oil terminals. It didn't. It bombed the anti-air site near a missile terminal, I think a Russian SAM site, actually. It didn't hit the oil terminal itself, but it showed it had the capability to do so without actually engaging in that escalatory action. So I think and hope, again, that both sides look at sort of a wider war in the region as counterproductive to their own interests and find ways of de-escalating it while minding their political as well as domestic sensitivities at home.
Vincent, it's interesting you mentioned that Iran is trying to send a message that it's fighting back or that it's fighting for certain causes. But if you look at the leadership in Iran, it's not as fundamentalist as what we've seen with Ahmadinejad, where many analysts have mentioned that the current president is actually more moderate. But what justifies or what's the motive behind what the US claims, as we've seen in a BBC report, that it's twice the attack of what we've seen in April?
I mean, listen, whether it's the Houthis or whether it's Hezbollah, they're under control of Iran. I mean, Iran Republican Guards essentially fund both organizations. They're both seen throughout the Middle East as directly, not indirectly, connected with Iranian leadership. And Iran would just show a major signal of weakness if they didn't do anything. And I think they're loath to show that because there goes all the prestige and all the power they've worked up to build over the decades in the Middle East.
So in your opinion, do you feel that this response is what you expect, or do you feel it's larger than what you had anticipated?
We know this phrase well. I mean, in Chinese, it's called 爱面子, 要面子, face, save face. And I think that's precisely probably the primary of Iran's considerations in launching that missile strike back, which is how do I show the region that I'm still a player? How do I show the region that, again, that I'm going to be able to make sure that Israel feels the pain of what they're doing in Hezbollah and against the Houthis? And I think the key point was, rather than substance, symbolism. And I think Iran chose to send a very symbolic message that they're fighting back, and they did so in a way I don't think that was escalatory in nature.
Professor Tai, let's talk a bit about Israel. It also attacked Lebanon in these few days. Do you feel that this attack on Lebanon is a different motive, as some have said that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to go on the offensive in the Middle East?
Yeah, but the thing is that Israeli actions in Palestinian territory, including military operations and settlement expansion, often provoke neighboring countries and United Arab countries to fight against Israel. So Israel is at multiple fronts of war, okay? For example, ongoing tensions with Hamas in Gaza, military incursions in Lebanon, fighting with Hezbollah, missile exchange with Iran, and Israeli airstrikes in Damascus in Syria, and attacks from Islamic resistance groups in Iraq. So that's a lot of stuff going on. So even in Chinese, even the first tiger cannot defeat a group of monkeys. So Israel is really in a bad fix. It's paid a piper time for Israel apartheid policy toward Palestinians. So my conclusion is the prospects of peace in the Middle East are very, very dim. Yeah.
Guermantes, what do you say to that in terms of, is Israel able to handle different fronts?
Well, if you notice that Israel first took on Hamas for almost a full year and pretty much degraded their ability to do anything to Israel significantly. Now they're going after Hezbollah, which is another tool of the Iranian regime, and they're taking them out. So these two terrorist groups prevented Israel from, deterred Israel from making an attack on Iran. And so by taking these two large terrorist organizations out, now Israel has more free reign to attack Iran without worrying about missiles coming from Hezbollah or from Hamas. I would say that the strategic problem here is that at some point Israel will run out of anti-missile missiles. And so the problem is that Iran has, it's estimated, over 3,000 ballistic missiles. And it's unknown the number of Israeli Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 missiles which are used for these kinds of ballistic missiles. And so Israel has to do something about these missiles coming at it. I mentioned before not only the WMD part, the nuclear weapon part, but also at some point they're going to run out of defenses. And they can't wait for that time to occur. So in my opinion, Israel has to smack down Iran from ever thinking about launching missiles again, because if they launch missiles and they don't have defenses and thousands or hundreds of people are killed, then you actually have escalation. So right now, Israel needs to do something to stop those missiles from coming, at a minimum. At a maximum, they need to take out the leadership of Iran, just like they took out the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah.
In terms of attacks from Israel, let me turn to Vincent. We've also seen Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, mention that Israelis are considering bombing or attacking nuclear-related facilities in Iran. Yeah. Do you feel this is a possibility, given that we've seen mixed signals from Washington with President Biden first saying he's discussing with the Israelis, and then
he
tracking
said,
that back. And then again we say, oh, I do not support this and do not support an Israeli attack on these facilities.
Well, that would be a precursor to a much wider conflict than what we see today if that took place. I mean, is it a possibility? Sure, it's a possibility. I mean, Biden essentially said it was a possibility. Biden said that this is something that they were discussing, but then he said, I think the point being, I think that may have been a step too far. It would have been maybe a completion of that sentence. I'm not sure, we weren't there, I'm not him. But certainly there was some reservations that were expressed in a second sentence that had trailed off, which was the comments that sent oil markets skyrocket in the past few days. But I think the point is that it could, particularly because I think Netanyahu's administration has actually shown that it's quite emboldened to take on particularly military risks. I mean, they've engaged in a campaign in Lebanon that few had thought possible. The last ground war in southern Lebanon was over a decade ago, and they're engaging in missile strikes in Beirut right now, which is almost unheard of. So he's willing, he's like Netanyahu is showing that they're willing to take a very, very forward-leaning stance in terms of how they employ their military superiority. Now, whether that extends to Iran, I think, again, it's a far different question, again, because Iran simply has much more resources and capabilities than we see compared to Hezbollah or the Houthis or even the Lebanese for that matter. And so if, for example, Israel were to make that calculation, like G-Man said, that it needed to do this for its own self-preservation and needed to engage in actions that were escalatory in nature, number one, I would hope and believe that that would be based on their best information, that if they did not do so, Iran would do something escalatory in response. I don't know. What I see from my perspective, which is a bit limited here in Taiwan, is that I don't think that's the case. But again, I don't have that sort of intelligence that both the United States and Israel does. But number two, that they would be able to effectively deter Iran by engaging in actions against their nuclear facilities. Again, I think that's an open question mark as well. Iran, certainly they're engaged in building nuclear weapons, or at least having that capability to do so. They're still far from having something capable. I mean, I think the best estimates we've seen in Western press has been, a couple months at the earliest, but years, in terms of a possibility. So in terms of whether bombing that nuclear facility actually builds deterrence, for Israel, I think, is a question mark, or it sparks a wider conventional war across the Middle East. And particularly problematic for Israel, of course, is a war on multiple fronts, not only against Gaza, against Hezbollah, but also against Iran. And what kind of future does that lead for the people of Israel? So I think these are tough questions that I don't presume to have the answers to, but certainly I hope are being considered seriously in Tel Aviv.
Professor Tai, in terms of what Vincent mentioned, the possibility of a conventional war or escalation, if Israel takes out the leadership in Iran and also attacks its nuclear facilities, what do you think will happen?
I think it will accelerate. Iran, they're gonna develop the nuclear weapons because those facilities are underground, right? If you try to attack them, maybe they couldn't hurt that much. So it's gonna open Pandora's box. You try to attack them, they're gonna develop their nukes very soon, and other neighboring countries, they will develop nuclear weapons as well because they are afraid of Iran will attack them.
But what if they successfully take out the leadership in Tehran? Say Israel has a very planned and
kill all the
coordinated-
leaders?
All the leaders in Tehran.
I don't really think so. It's very hard. They do have the most advanced missile system from Russia. So it's very, very hard. Maybe you can have a decisive victory, even if you can attack them, right? But it doesn't mean you can have a decisive victory. That's the problem here. And also during the American presidential elections, this is not a good idea because Biden will tell Netanyahu, hold your horses. It's not a good time, okay? Maybe after elections, you can do something. But the thing is that US is not gonna give Israel a blank check. That's the thing. You cannot do anything because it's gonna end up a regional war, okay? That's the key issue here.
I wanted to turn back to what Professor Tai said in terms of Russian support, and Russia's other ally is China. Guermantes, how do you feel Russia and China are influencing this? As you mentioned earlier, China has sold weapons to Iran.
Both China and Russia have been supplying weapons to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, and to Iran. That's number one. Number two, at a minimum, the Iranians consulted with China and Russia before they struck Israel, at a minimum, because obviously if Israel struck hard back, they would want Russia and China to help them deal with Israel. At a maximum, it's possible that China encouraged and Russia encouraged Iran to take on Israel because in the grand scheme of strategy, by having the United States occupied by a Middle East war, a Ukrainian war, would perhaps give an opportunity to China to do something against Taiwan. So these are big picture things outside the Middle East that affect what's happening here in Taiwan. The other thing I wanted to mention was Iran and Iraq from 1980 to 1988 had a missile war. And both sides exchanged lots of missiles. They didn't have missile defense then, and it was a pulverizing war between the two countries. Israel does not want this kind of war because, as I mentioned, eventually they're going to run out of their missile defense systems. And then they have very few options, except perhaps if they have nuclear weapons, they might use them on Iran as well. So before they get there, I think Iran is pushing Israel to the precipice of making a decision about what to do. They don't want this to continue, this pattern of Iran launching missiles and Israel responding in a sort of a mild, minimum way.
So what should Israel do?
So I think that Israel should look at these following target areas. First of all, I mentioned the Iranian leadership. Second, the ballistic missile launchers. This is the biggest problem currently, is if they take out the missile launchers, then they can't launch the missiles. The third, Israel could attack economic targets to make the Iranian government and the people understand that attacking Israel has not only the costs against the military, but imposed costs against the entire society. And fourth, as was mentioned before, to remove the nuclear threat, which is maybe not a tactical problem right now, but it will be an operational and a strategic thing. So these are all things that Israel could do. And of course, they could do this not only through the military, but as was seen by the Mossad in Lebanon. They took out the Nasrallah. They found out where Nasrallah was, and the Israeli Air Force bombed them. They took out almost 3,000 of their main leadership by using pagers, right? We know about that. So there are a lot of ways to do these actions besides a direct military thing, and also it could be economic. So all these things can be calculated in Israel's response.
We see a lot of uncertainty, Vincent, in terms of what's happening in the Middle East with Israel and Iran, and we also see Lebanon, and there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how Israel will respond to these attacks. And there's also Ukraine, which Guermantes mentioned earlier, and we've seen conflicting comments coming from both the current Vice President, former President Donald Trump, in terms of what would be the appropriate response to both Ukraine and Iran. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, there are some parallels between Israel and Iran and Ukraine. I mean, I don't think there are a lot of parallels, but there are some parallels in the sense that both of them were attacked brazenly and deserve support from democracies around the world in terms of maintaining their right to self-defense. I'll say this. Last year, I was in this Halifax International Security Forum, and I think they were ahead of their time because one of the topics we discussed there was called crinks. And it sounds like I'm very angry, or it's sort of a swear word, but it's not. Crinks essentially refers to China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And the idea that we should label them together, because these sort of are. I mean, these are a gathering of authoritarian states that are ruled by either wannabe or dictators themselves, and have close coordination, whether in regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine or in destabilizing the Middle East, as Iran has done for decades. So there's a lot of similarities there. But that's sort of on the adversary side. On the Israel and Ukraine side, I would say this. I think the response should be markedly different. I mean, there are some similarities we saw last year when an aid package was discussed. I mean, there are differences in opinions between, how much the United States should support Israel, how much they should support Ukraine, and then how much they should support Taiwan. And, we in Taiwan were obviously happy to see that we received the most votes of these three different packages in Congress. We received the least amount of dissenters. So, I mean, Taiwan is very much an issue that transcends party lines in the United States, but not so much for Ukraine, where there is a sizable, I think, part of the Republican Party that is highly suspicious of whether this money is worth American taxpayers or consistent with U.S. interests. And on the Democrat side, there are also a lot of progressives that are unhappy at the way Israel's conducted this war against Hamas, and certainly have demanded more accountability in terms of aid, in particular weapon transfer. So with all of that said, I think we should be clear in labeling these destabilizing actors for who they are, which is they are working together, are working in tandem, and they are working to destabilize, whether it's here in Indo-Pacific or the Middle East or in Europe. And I think the key purpose is actually quite similar, which is this. They are all seeking to destabilize this international order that we've had since the Second World War and has served countries around the world so well. And I think of particular interest, and G-Man for Taiwan, is that I think if I were China, I would be highly, highly supportive of any further actions to destabilize the Middle East, because that would be completely consistent with my core interest, which is to draw the U.S. into as many different battlefields as possible and to water down their commitments in the Pacific region. So it's very much aligned with their interests. And hopefully I'm wrong, but I do foresee that China's support for destabilizing actors in the Middle East will continue in earnest in years to come.
You were previously in Washington. You've seen policy making in D.C. and Congress up close. Do you feel there is this awareness in terms of linking China with the other authoritarian regimes?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely do so. I mean, again, that's not a party line issue at all. Like, even if people have skepticism towards Ukraine, I think people still realize that, Russia is the main problem here, and Russia's alliance, if you will, or Russia's friendship with China is destabilizing in many, many different respects, whether we're talking about energy or the economy or trade, or certainly kinetic action in Europe and potentially here in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there is a lot of awareness that these authoritarian states are increasingly working together in tandem to challenge not only this U.S.-led order, but really just this international order that has been the foundation of what has made us so prosperous over the past 70 years.
Professor Chai, do you feel there's anything Taiwan needs to do in terms of preparing for what we see as authoritarians banding together and attacking democracies, given the US election is coming up and we see different comments from different candidates? Do you feel US support could shift in terms of Taiwan or Ukraine, or even here with Israel, the conflict we're talking about?
But even some Republican politicians, they don't want to support for Ukraine, but still they think the main point is Taiwan because US has to come back to the Indo-Pacific. That's the thing, because the main competition, the main rivalry is China.
Is that because US national interest is tied to Taiwan?
No, it's because great power competition. It's nothing to do with geopolitical stuff. It's great power competition. Thucydides trap. That's very famous in IR theory. Okay, big nations, they have to compete with each other because it's a zero-sum game. And Taiwan is, of course, it's in First Island chain, so this is very important. It's a critical node for US, especially in terms of economy, chips, a lot of stuff. Yeah, this is very important.
Thank you very much for all your insights today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and see you next time.